Welcome and happy Pride. Thank you for joining the Yale Black Alumni Association and Yale Gala for our Pride Month event, James Baldwin's Queer Revolution. My name is Nicholas Roman Lewis, and I will be your co-host tonight, along with the amazing Regina Bain, who is chair of the Yale Black Alumni Association, a member of the Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors, and the executive director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum. Tonight, we will have a lecture from Kevin Quinn, followed by a discussion and Q&A. But first, a few words from Regina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Regina Bain, Executive Director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum and the leader of the Yale Black Alumni Association. Happy Pride, everyone. We are so proud to be a part of this important conversation, and we look forward to future conversations. So if you are interested in getting involved with the Yale Black Alumni Association, please reach out. We would love to have you join us and lead us in the conversations that matter. And now, back to Nicholas.
Thank you, Regina. So a reminder to our audience to post your questions and any comments in the Q&A, and during our discussion, we will make sure that we bring those up. So I am very excited to introduce our speaker tonight. Kevin Quinn graduated from Yale in 2001 with a degree in English. He is a teacher and writer currently based in San Francisco after many years abroad in Hong Kong. Kevin is also a noted literary critic, having published in Politico magazine, the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and coming later this summer, Citizen magazine. You can find him at Kevin Quinn Reads on Instagram. So before we welcome Kevin to the stage, we have a little intro.
Now, when you were starting out as a writer, you were a black, impoverished homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
It was so outrageous you could not go any further, you know. So you had to find a way to use it.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Regina, and thank you to all of you for joining this conversation. Anybody who knows me knows that I am always excited to talk about Baldwin, and particularly in this context. So I'm hoping in the next few minutes I can share some thoughts about Baldwin that I hope will add to what I always want, which is a kind of ever-growing appreciation of Baldwin's importance, not just in our conversations about race, but also in our conversations about queer consciousness and queer identity. I want to just say that I'm not going to talk about The Fire Next Time, at least in my remarks, nor even other things that we might be familiar with that are rather quotable in from Baldwin's oeuvre. But what I really want to talk about today, as I've named this talk, is what I think of as really Baldwin's sort of singular importance in the queer American context. So many of us came to understand Baldwin through either one of two ways, I would suspect, through his writings, for example, in The Fire Next Time, or perhaps Go Tell on the Mountain, in which he deals somewhat incisively with the problem of race relations in the American context. But then many of us have personal relationships with what Baldwin really revealed to us about our queer selves through novels, for example, like Giovanni's Room, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. But my objective for the evening really is to help center, I think, Baldwin's really, as I said, singular importance in helping us think about what queer identity actually is, what it can be, perhaps what it has been misunderstood to be, and how we might, in the same way that he gives us rather prophetic instructions for race relations in the US, how we might think of ourselves, that is queer and anywhere else along the spectrum, as living a rather interchangeable and interrelated life. That seems to me to be the key to understanding Baldwin's singular importance in this respect. I'm going to start by showing you a quotation that I think is rather provocative. And though sometimes I don't like to do talks where you just look at text on a screen, because you all are not my students and I didn't have the advantage of giving the work beforehand, I am going to look at this one particular quotation, and it will be what I use to kind of center my remarks. So Nicholas, can I have that first quotation? So here is the redoubtable Ralph Ellison writing about James Baldwin. This is in a note that Baldwin wrote, that Ellison wrote to a friend of his in the 1960s, right after Baldwin's novel Another Country had come out, along with some other things like the A-Man Corner. And what's notable about this quotation is what I'm going to describe as Ellison's sort of straight panic here. You see in these remarks something that Ellison seems to believe that Baldwin wants from a kind of space that he's perhaps been disallowed from, right? So Ellison says, perhaps what Baldwin is telling white Americans is allow Negroes to sleep with your daughters or we homos will sleep with you. Now, beyond the sort of shocking homophobia is what I think is really important in terms of the ways in which Baldwin has been misunderstood, and certainly the ways his project has been misunderstood. Ellison and many others complained that Baldwin was obsessed with sex and that he had elevated sort of personal problems to the kind of national stage. And those remarks seem to me, at least, to misunderstand, I think, what is so fundamentally, in many ways, prophetic about Baldwin's project. And that is that the individual is sort of inseparable from the collective. And that in order really to kind of gain any sort of traction where individual relationships are concerned, one has to realize the extent to which he is interconnected from the other. The other, for example, can be, let's say, in terms of race relations, the Black person in America. That is, that the white person has to understand that these two individual existences meld together most perfectly when there is actual excavation and investigation of the self. What am I doing? Why am I doing it, right? Baldwin famously said, I am only Black as long as you consider yourself white. But if we look at what Ellison says here, it seems to be that Ellison thinks that Baldwin wants some sort of access into this world that Ellison and others, primarily straight people, think is preferable to their own. And so he cannot see that Baldwin's assertion of a sort of individual queer self through writings like Another Country and Giovanni's Room is really about the extent to which, as I said, each of us occupies a space that is inextricably linked to the people around us. Another way to frame it is like this. Baldwin famously said that the phrase civil rights movement was in some sense nonsensical, because if Black Americans were already citizens, then there's no space in which we should be fighting for civil rights. To be a citizen then should mean that these rights, of course, already belong to you. So what I'm going to try to argue in the minutes that remain is that what Baldwin is offering us in his depiction of homosexuality or queer identity is the idea that there is a sort of queer citizenry. If I were going to coin a phrase to help us think about what queer consciousness means in the space of a sort of heteronormative world, Baldwin is suggesting that queer citizenry is inextricably linked to everything else, right? And the presentation of that, self-valued identity, that self-valued queer identity, is about really arguing for a queer citizenry that cannot be second place, that should not be relegated to the margins, but rather should be woven naturally into the space that we all call our American context. And finally, to put it another way, Baldwin is not suggesting to Ellison that I want to be a part of your space, but rather I am the space, right? You and I both occupy the same space, and it doesn't belong with any degree of ownership more to one or the other. Okay, so that's, I hope, a helpful framing to think about Baldwin's preeminence in these conversations. Now, let's turn to Giovanni's Room, a novel I'm sure that most of us are familiar with, but I want to kind of think about why this novel is so important. Why does a writer like Baldwin, who had already gained a lot of fame with his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, decide with his second novel to write Giovanni's Room, a novel which is frankly about queer desire and queer identity, and very importantly, and very geniusly, in which there are no Black characters. Every time I teach this novel, and I have been teaching it for quite a while now, I always ask my students to consider what I propose as the sort of possibility of an American allegory here, an allegory about American identity. What does queer consciousness, as presented in this novel, have to teach us about the American context? And is this novel simply about queer desire, or does it actually have something to do with Baldwin's project as we've seen it so many times before? Another question would be, what does this novel have to tell us about race when there are no Black characters in the novel, and when we've come to expect from Baldwin a kind of frank confrontation with racial concerns? A few years ago, the New York Times Magazine did a kind of retrospective on Giovanni's Room, and the photographer John Edmonds staged a reshoot, or sort of imagination of what these two characters, Giovanni and David, might have looked like in the space that they occupied. And he chose to do something very particular. Edmonds said that Baldwin didn't have any Black characters in Giovanni's Room because he wanted to he had to write white characters, that somehow he didn't have the privilege or the freedom to write Black characters. And so he used white characters as a way to kind of subvert that sort of stifling. Therefore, Edmonds, in his photographic essay, chose to cast a Black man in the role of David, saying that if Baldwin really had been able to do what he wanted to do, he would have used a Black person in his novel. But since he couldn't, he did not. Hilton Alls of The New Yorker wrote an accompanying piece in the New York Times Magazine, effectively agreeing with Edmonds, suggesting that Baldwin essentially transferred a sort of longing, perhaps for whiteness, or perhaps for the mobility of whiteness, in not having any Black characters in this novel, which is about queer desire. And I'd like to suggest that those are misreadings, that Baldwin's very particular choice here, to have a novel which encompasses queer identity and queer desire, not have any Black characters in it, and the fact that he's an American writer and that much of the novel takes place in Paris, is very much at the center of his grand and beautifully capacious project in terms of advancing our consciousness with regard to queer identity. So let's talk about the novel first. If you've never read it, it's simply about this. A white man named David leaves New York because he is, in some ways, uncomfortable with the identity that he knows to be queer. He wants to flee that identity, so he goes to Paris, and upon arrival in Paris, feels that he can live a sort of anonymous life, and then finds himself in a relationship with an Italian man named Giovanni. The relationship is tumultuous. David is also engaged to a woman who flees conveniently for narrative purposes so that the relationship between him and Giovanni can develop. But he's not quite able to reconcile the self that he wanted in New York with the self that he finds in Paris, and ends up effectively destroying Giovanni's life. He only wants that queer identity in the confines of Giovanni's Room, hence the title of the novel. But when they are in public, when they're out in spaces where he can be recognized, where he can potentially be defined, he shuns Giovanni. And I won't tell you what happens in case you haven't read the novel. Now, beyond all of that, many of us who read this novel a long time ago, were so kind of moved by Baldwin's frank depiction of queer desire. I, as a bit of a prop, have with me my copy of the book, which I bought more than 20 years ago at Crossroads Bookstore in Houston. And This was a novel that sort of revolutionized my understanding of who I was as a queer person, but also the possibility that Baldwin could have been excavating so expertly things about myself that I was trying to hide, that I sort of wanted to deny. How did he know, I kept saying when I read this first as a 19-year-old, how did he know all of these things about me? The same man who had written Go Tell on the Mountain about a boy who grows up in Harlem and is a part of the Black church. This is the same person, okay? And why is he doing this? That visibility that this novel presents us with is something that I think a lot of queer people have latched onto, but it might not be clear to most people just how revolutionary a text this is. 1956, sort of as the civil rights movement is starting, before what we call the gay rights movement has begun. There are, of course, flickerings of this well before the 1960s, but before we really have sort of popularized that movement, Baldwin chooses to do this. It's his second novel. It's a risky move, but ever the prophet, Baldwin, I think, is showing us what it means to be American, what the complications are as a result of that identity, and in this novel, using queerness as a way to help us think very much about how the American context is very much fraught with an assault on the individual self. Certainly if that self is a Black self, and indeed in this novel, especially when it's a queer self. In that sense then, I'd like to argue that the importance of this novel is that as a national sort of allegory, what Baldwin is showing us through the character David is that David, as a white person who goes to Paris in order to kind of leave his queer self behind, and in effect plunders this kind of othered identity that is Giovanni the Italian, right? That is what this sort of American disposition is all about. It's important that David believes that he can have Giovanni when he wants him and then discard him in much the same way for Baldwin that in terms of racial relations, whiteness plunders Blackness, takes of it what it needs, and then kind of leaves when it doesn't want anymore, when it doesn't in effect want to confront, right? These very, very, very clear examples of the ways in which inequities persist because white consciousness does not want to, for lack of a better phrase, get real. And that, I think, is the strength of using this novel, which explores queer identity alongside what Baldwin is doing, I think, allegorically, in terms of showing us that the American context, where Black people are concerned, is very much the same as the kind of heteronormative context where queer people are concerned. There is plunder for the uses of queerness, but then there is discarding of those people, sometimes literally and in violent ways. And that is a part of the American refusal to see the very, very intricate ways in which we are all interconnected. That, I think, is what is so revolutionary about Baldwin's project. You cannot really name many writers during the time who took the sort of risk to show queer people who we are in the 1950s. In fact, when Baldwin first proposed this novel to his publishers, they refused to publish it, unsurprisingly. So he had to actually seek to get it published elsewhere, outside of the US. That revolutionary impulse to make us see ourselves is, I think, the thrust of what queer identity is all about. And also not to shy away from sex, right? In the beginning of this novel, as I like to tell my students, it begins with the narrator, David, looking at himself and seeing his reflection in a mirror. And that is Baldwin at his metaphorical best. You have to look at yourself. You have to be confronted with who it is that you are, without any labels that anybody wants to impose upon you, but who it is that you are in order to move forward, right? And there are several instances of this kind of reflective confrontation that you find in the novel with windows and mirrors. This is what America won't do. It won't look at itself and see what it has done, right? Whiteness won't reckon with the kind of legacy of plunder with which it has been historically involved. But if we can, right, as queer and as Black people, reckon with ourselves, we might then, I think, reach a place of individuality that, in some sense, discards the impositions of whiteness that are so sort of rife in the American context. I think that that's revolutionary. I think that there is no better example of that occurring in the middle of the 20th century. And I do think that it's very important that this is happening through the vehicle of fiction, because of course we are all familiar with Baldwin's essays. Everybody likes to quote Baldwin's essays, The Fire Next Time, that's going around. There's all of these new anthologies about Baldwin coming out, I'm Not Your Negro, all of these things. But most people actually kind of forget the critical element of Baldwin's queerness, which he insisted upon, as you saw in the opening clip, as not a liability, but actually something that is sort of necessarily an example of intersectionality. There is no, in my thinking, more revolutionary act than to present one as oneself. When Giovanni's Room came out, Baldwin famously said in an interview, he did that is to say, confronted queerness frankly in a novel, because it meant that no one else would have any more power over him. He said famously, it meant that I told you, you didn't tell me, right? That's a very classic conceit in a lot of American literature, this idea of the I voice, I said it myself. And so the permission, right, to own an I voice, you see that in both his calls for Black people to really own their dignity, as well as for queer people to own theirs. That, I think, is the thrust of what I've been calling Baldwin's queer revolution. And I think that we can think about queerness not just as an expression of sexuality, but as an express of any sort of othered space, which is very often assaulted, right? There is a dignity when you read Go Tell It on the Mountain. Baldwin Morrison quotes this very often, Baldwin saying that one of the things that he had to do in terms of being a novelist was to get the white man off his shoulder, whom he always thought he had to improve. Is a white man going to like this writing? And you can see then that the writing is dignified unto itself and doesn't need permission, right? And that, of course, is a hallmark of Toni Morrison's work. I think with a novel like Giovanni's Room, the same thing is true. You felt, in Baldwin's parlance, that he had borne witness, right, to what it is that you were and what it is that you could be. And that is a powerful thing to give, right? Permission to exist in the world as an unfettered self. That is part of, I think, Baldwin's revolutionary project. And to do that, when many, for example, people like Ellison discarded him on the grounds of a kind of too confrontational presentation of the queer self. That, I think, is a powerful, powerful act of assertion. And we have Baldwin to thank for that very, very powerfully. Okay, can I have that next quotation? Okay, this is just, I think, one of the last things that we'll look at. It's the character in this novel saying to David that what he really should do is, in some sense, reject the kind of narrative of the culture and do what it is that he's being individually motivated to do. It's very, very important injunction that Baldwin is making through the character Jacques here. If you will only not play it safe. That is a revolutionary thing to say to any queer self in the 1950s and even before, right? Giving one permission not to be safe, not to kind of go along with the mainstream narrative. So in closing, I think what I want to offer about Giovanni's Room and really about Baldwin's project as a whole, but particularly in this novel, is this understanding that there is no free self in the American context until all people, oppressors and oppressed alike, understand this kind of interrelated relationship that we are sort of inextricably linked to each other, and that an assertion of self is the only way, right, that we can cause there to be a kind of needful confrontation with the things that ultimately segment us. We won't need to be drawn along lines of sexuality or race, for example, when we understand the extent to which there is really a kind of rich space for everybody involved. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy now to talk about any and all things Baldwin.
Thank you, Kevin. Quinn. Let's get Regina into the stream. Perfect. Wow, I have all these notes. I really felt like I was back in classroom.
I kept wanting to say, speak on it. Just speak on it.
A little classroom, a little church. You know, this
Baldwin, classroom and church. That's a great.
Yeah, you have to come correct too. And it's funny, we had a few comments that from Kenise Lyons. This was with regard to when you were talking about whiteness and the use of blackness and then kind of leaving it. And some of her comments, let's get this computer up. She's just talking about this, and I thought that was really interesting that you had some feedback there. So let's just have a conversation amongst ourselves, and I encourage everyone who's watching, got a lot of folks watching, to please write your comments or questions, and we'll try to get to them. But let me throw one out first to you, Kevin. So you know, I know you teach Baldwin to your high school students. I'm actually wanting to know which works you do teach, but you know, currently there has been so many references to Baldwin in pop culture and all the talking heads on CNN, or probably not Fox, but CNN, over the last year. So do you get the sense that more people are reading Baldwin intently? Like, what is your take on that?
I think it's very sort of a kind of contextual moment, to be sure. We always turn to Baldwin when things are going particularly badly vis-a-vis race relations. So George Floyd set off a flurry of reflections. Everybody was buying The Fire Next Time. You know, people were like, I read that Baldwin, and I always knew which one it was that they read. I teach them all, I really do. And in fact, last semester I taught Giovanni's room. And it's that's the thing that people don't read, right? I mean, I think it's because everyone quotes, you know, what he has to say about race relations. I think that they're reading him intently, but perhaps sometimes with a blind spot, because I think if I didn't make this point clearly enough, for Baldwin, the kind of queer consciousness is inextricably linked to Black consciousness, and the ways in which both groups of people can be oppressed is not a fluke. Right? That is something that's actually germane to the American way of doing things. That is why David in that novel has to be white, because Baldwin could only show you that through this guy who goes to Paris, gets up with this guy, and it's like, I don't want you anymore, right? That is a kind of, as I said, it's an American allegory. So we're reading him intently, but I do think, you know, look at what Ellison said. Can you imagine? Ralph Ellison said that about Baldwin, right? We're reading him intently, but I think we're missing the extent to which we can't sort of parse out Blackness from any kind of othered experience.
So, I mean, I'm not shocked that Ellison said that, because I immediately look at, it's a heteronormative, right? And so it's just about the other. So in this case, it has to be a kind of, as you said, you know, Baldwin saying that I am the space.
I'm the space.
You're not asking for permission.
That's right.
And clearly that's what, the little I do know about Toni Morrison's work, no permission asked.
That's right. That's right.
That stood out to me so strongly when you talked about how the different editors were deciding what Baldwin's motivation was in making Giovanni's characters white. When you were describing that, I am not a Baldwin scholar, but I immediately thought, that's not it. That's not it. And when you talked about I'm not trying to occupy the space. I am the space, and I am the space in all of my intersectionality. And you can't parse that away, any of it away from me. It seems such a powerful approach to life. And I'm curious how you see that type of intersectionality playing out today. How Baldwin would see that playing out today.
Yeah, I was just watching an interview a couple of nights ago with Baldwin, in which he said to an interviewer, and a white interviewer, "You all seem to think," he said, "I'm sorry to say that I want something from you. Like, I want your world, and then my favorite phrase, he says, it's as if you don't think that I went to your wedding and saw how everything worked out after, right? So I was a witness to this experience. And he says, what makes you think I want to be a part of that world? Look at it. I have my own, right? I occupy my own space. For those of you who are really literary, he starts Giovanni's Room with an epigraph from Walt Whitman, and we all know Walt Whitman probably from saying, I contain multitudes, right? I'm all of you, right? So that's the idea here. And I think for Baldwin to have suffered as much homophobia as he did, often from other Black people, was a failure and a blind spot to see the extent to which, right, that assertion of the self is what we all need and want, right? I'm not asserting my queerness outside of my Blackness. Both of those things, in some sense, meld together equally and perfectly for a whole self. And I think that whole self is what Baldwin's work wants to address.
So, I mean, I know you're a writer, you're a teacher, you're a scholar. You're not on the front where you're not a politician, right?
Sadly not.
My question goes to progress. From your lens, you do work with young people and you do have a historical lens. So what do you think of the progress? Because when I'm still centered around this, you brought out this notion of queer citizenry. So from the 1950s, a completely different world. And so there has been progress.
Yeah.
But, I'm wondering about, Baldwin's, was there loneliness in that space, in that queer space, in that I am this space, I don't need yours. And then that kind of progress where to today, like, how do you, what do you, in your students and, friends and things, what do you see that progress?
Yeah. I think most people say things like, what are like conservative commentators are always talking about? They're snowflakes. They can't take anything. And I think it's actually exactly the opposite. I mean, you're talking now about some of the most generously conscious people that you can actually interact with, that is young people, students. You present a novel like Giovanni's Room to them, and it's almost like, kind of a man corner, right? It's like, yes, of course, this assertion of self is actually, yes, they get it, they really do. And they don't take time to think about, well, the sex makes me uncomfortable, but I like the messaging. They understand that those two things actually can't be separated, right? I didn't mention this probably enough, Baldwin's incredible engagement with sort of sexual freedom, right? If you read Another Country, which is the novel that Ellison was complaining about, it's too much sex, right? That novel is kind of brilliant for its refusal to use sexual categories to define people's identity, right? So you can get frustrated, be like, I thought he was with that girl, now he's with this guy, right? So I think our young people are prepared to have those kinds of conversations. I'm much more hopeful about the world that they're advancing us toward than the world that I grew up in, for example. And they actually don't bring the sort of baggage to Baldwin, right? The kind of hallmark quotable baggage that refuses to see a kind of whole landscape.
Kevin, I have a question from the audience. Let me bring this up. So Megan Hogan from class of 2000, and a shade groupie. Fantastic talk. Wondering if you could speak to Baldwin's position, if any, on the feminist movement Not sure if you spoke on this topic.
I didn't say anything about that specifically, but thank you for the question. There's a lot of critics who seem to think that Baldwin was at some times misogynistic, that his focus on, for example, men sometimes specifically, and gay men rather than lesbians, for example, meant that he kind of impugned or fell into traps that were sort of like stereotypical. And then I always remind them of the novel If Beale Street Could Talk, which a lot of people haven't read, but there was a film of that recently made by the wonderful
Barry Jenkins.
Barry Jenkins, thank you. That is Baldwin's only novel with a female protagonist, who's the central character. And that novel is about the unimaginable importance of Black women. I mean, it's just like that is a love letter to Black women. She without her, there is no other character in that novel. The women are doing. So I think it's a sort of a short-sighted assessment to think that Baldwin, if he didn't say, for example, that, the word feminism, that he wasn't actually understanding, again, the intersectional reality that women face, right? That queer people face, that Black people face all together. I do think it's important to note how much Baldwin resisted sort of acceptable terminology. So he never was a sort of, as I said earlier, he wasn't like, this is the civil rights movement. He's like, it's not a civil rights movement. I'm a citizen. I don't fight for rights if I'm a citizen, right? He may not have said the word feminism, but I think you can tell from his writing what his position is about women. Very, very, very particularly. I also have to say, too, literarily, all of Baldwin's protagonists in his novels don't have fathers, and they're raised by these very, very prominent women, usually aunt figures. That's a trope that we see even dating back to Jane Austen, this kind of celebration of the surrogate mother figure. So I think it would be hard to make the case that Baldwin was not interested in women's liberation as well.
And as I read Baldwin, as I look at his texts, I notice that focus on men and masculinity, and I appreciate it. It seems like a focus that is about who he is and how he sees the world, but that doesn't leave me out.
That's right.
And I can't point to why I feel that way, but that is the way that I feel when I read him. I notice that focus on men and masculinity, and it seems right and truthful for that to be a point of focus and depth that welcomes me in.
I think especially in the contexts in which those novels occur, right? There is an assault on, I'm going to say this, but I hope I can make clear what I mean. I don't mean an assault on Black masculinity as if masculinity is this thing that we have to want. I mean the sort of personhood of the man who is Black. Does that make sense? So when you see Baldwin engaging these kind of torrential struggles for Black men to be persons in the world, I think that that's the way that we should look at it. And in that sense, you're right, Regina, we are all involved in that. If somebody's assaulting your personhood in a Baldwin world, that matters to me because it affects me.
But I also think that given the time, it is a revolutionary act to say, I'm gay, I mean the masculinity, to claim that, because that is something that is being held against you, a liability, if you will. And as he said in the very beginning, I hit the jackpot, right? Sure. So I think that's a part of it as well. Let's get some more questions coming from the audience. Here's one from Susan Thomas. So when you teach Baldwin to white cisgender students, how do they react?
It's revelatory and nourishing. I really do think that it's hard to get into Baldwin and not feel completely sort of transformed by this, act. As I wrote in my thesis many, many years ago, Baldwin's grand act of bearing witness, right? He bears witness to who you are. And I think that those truths plumb depths that most writers don't get into. I've never had a student, for example, not be pleasantly and sort of helpfully confronted by the things in a Baldwin text. it's one of the reasons that I wish Baldwin were taught more at the high school level. It used to be the case 20 years ago that that was happening, but not anymore. And I think that that has something to do, I actually said this on a panel some years ago, I think that has something to do with his queerness, that people don't want to wrestle with the other questions that you might ask once you're dealing with, you know, even in Go Tell on the Mountain, we see a kind of queer tension between John and Elisha. So it's always been there, but people kind of, they want the fire next time. They don't want Giovanni's room.
And here's a question from Ariana Gonzalez. So what will Baldwin say about today's version of take what you want and discard the rest, i.e. Juneteenth holiday versus meaningful policy, companies with rainbow logos but funding anti-LGBTQIA politicians?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think Baldwin would be predictably kind of exasperated with those two, with that tension. And I think he sort of started to address some of those things as well. I think what he would probably suggest, and this is a sort of unfair act of ventriloquism on my part, but I think he would probably suggest that the more that the focus on the individual pushes back against how people want us to kind of be, you know, put in these sort of collective boxes, right? In other words, it's easy to be susceptible to, the kind of corporatization and the capitalization of things like Juneteenth and Pride and all of those things, mostly if you're not doing that digging yourself to even see what's wrong in the first place, right? To see the inconsistencies, to see what's problematic, right? I think he would turn us back to ourselves and try to urge us to kind of gain a kind of individual control that we then pour back in the face of all of that kind of corporate and capitalistic narrativizing.
So let me ask a question. Thanks to Kevin for that answer. Let me ask a question to both Kevin and Regina. So Regina, as I stated, is also the executive director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum. And we were chatting earlier about, James Baldwin, Louis Armstrong, two very iconic Black men. So some people, might consider Baldwin the quintessential angry Black man. However, we know this is a narrative that is always put on, in a caption, always put on people of color who are simply refusing the status quo. So I wanted to know about James Baldwin's joy. And I was thinking, how does that compare to someone like Louis Armstrong, who we usually think of as just a happy guy? I mean, he's the ambassador for jazz throughout the world. It is all just love when you think of Louis Armstrong in your head, not the angry Black man. And I think both had, make choices. So what do you two think about that? Because both of you have, that's part of your work and how you, your careers.
So I can start from my perspective. So I think about the roles that individuals and specifically Black men are often put into, that you have to be one or the other. Like you have to be connected to your race or your sexuality, or in the same way, you either are angry or you are happy. And we know that human beings, if we are to acknowledge the humanity of a person, that human beings are more complex than that. So of course, Louis Armstrong had anger. Of course, he's a human being. Of course, James Baldwin had joy. He is a human being. But it's when we require that someone fits into something that we understand, and that we can define, that we don't allow that. And so for Louis Armstrong, when he put his anger forward, and he talked about what was happening with the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas, and he talked about President Eisenhower, and he talked about those things, and he said, I think I have the right to be angry. The response was, no, you don't. You are our beloved. We expect that from you. And now that you're giving us something different, I don't think that we can accept you anymore. So he was blacklisted. And it wasn't until white allies said, if you don't have Louis Armstrong on this broadcast and I'm not coming, that he was able to come back.
Yeah.
So there's this desire, I think, to compartmentalize in order to erase humanity. And I see that in both Louis Armstrong and James Baldwin.
Sure. I think most of us have watched that very famous debate between William Buckley and Baldwin on the question of, has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro, which took place at Cambridge University in England. And one of the things that Buckley foolishly accuses Baldwin of is being sort of rage-filled, right? You know, his fiery prose, Buckley says. And I always think of that as a sort of curious accusation, right? Baldwin would say, as if I'm supposed to sit down and be quiet when the house is on fire, you know, just supposed to sit there and kind of behave, right? But on the other hand, there's a great story that Gwendolyn Brooks tells about Baldwin, which is so lovely. He was visiting her in Chicago, and she says, everybody who knows Baldwin knows he is the most joyful person alive. And she says, despite having written The Fire Next Time, right? Just to say, you know, it's like, these things I think are not sort of in conflict with one another. In fact, Baldwin talks very often about how he can't afford to be a pessimist, right? So there is no sort of languishing just because you're shining a flashlight to the realities that exist in the world. In other words, you don't have to then refuse to see joy or have opportunities for joy, you know, in one's life. And, you know, may he rest in peace, but we all know how he died. You know, this is not a man who didn't enjoy his life. So I think that these things are not in conflict with each other. But as you said, Regina, it's particularly sort of, there's a sort of privileged arrogance to accuse somebody who is telling the truth of being angry.
I'm often
and I love that these two men met each other. Yes. So James Baldwin was at the Newport Jazz Festival and heard Louis Armstrong play, and he was playing the Star Spangled Banner. And there's a story of him leaning to the person next to him, I believe it was Dan Morgenstern, and saying, that's the first time I've liked that song. Mm-hmm. So they were connected, and in these potentially what people might think of as polar opposites, saw something in each other.
Just quickly on that, there's a great essay which is very sort of it's fairly obscure Baldwin essay, but it's called "Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare," and I always give it to my students, particularly before I teach Shakespeare, but for the reason that you just mentioned and what was sort of germane to my talk, and that is Baldwin said, Shakespeare is me, right? You don't get to claim that is just for your hollowed academic space, right? He's like, I have as much to do with that than anybody else on the planet. It's mine. And the sort of, you know, assumption that we are segmented from language that very nearly has invented us because we have been oppressed peoples, according to Baldwin, was nonsense.
So that brings me to a question I thought that I liked when I wrote it. He came back today and had to write an op-ed. What would the op-ed be? What would the title be? What would it be? And I could see he probably has to write many op-eds. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think his op-ed would be about what I sometimes like to call hysterical consciousness. That is the sort of the woke movement that's not really woke. It's just catatonic. People's eyes are just open, but they're not actually seeing what's really going on. On the one hand, I think that we've moved into a great space in which people want to know what is happening, but I think a lot of people don't want to do the work, right? The excavation, the learning, the sort of, before you accuse somebody of, for example, of cultural appropriation, you know, do you know what that means, right? And I think Baldwin would be very interested in suggesting to us that, you know, again, a movement in which you want people to be aware and socially conscious has to start with appealing to humanity, right? It's not a sort of, I got you, you did this bad thing, and therefore you're my enemy. It's really about, okay, can I give you a mirror so that you can see this? And now how do we both solve this problem together? And you don't do that by assuming that your critical positionality is, flawless just because you're the oppressed person.
And that's a very good a point when you stated appealing to humanity. And I believe that's a through line that you can pull out through your lecture today, as well as some of Regina's comments and knowing the work of Louis Armstrong and just the music, right? The through line of appealing to humanity. So I'm wondering with your students, do you see young activists? Do you see the young the ones who are the young writers? Like, what are the themes that they are dealing with? Obviously, writers deal with lots of different things, but related to this, are there themes that you see bubbling up?
Yeah, and it just makes me think that the difference, I think, between my students and a lot of people who are thought to be doing the work, this abstract term, the work, is that my students are teachable. They say, if I tell them, oh, that's not actually what misogyny means, they go, oh, okay, tell me what it means, right? They exist in a space where they can be told, I don't think you've thought about that deeply enough. And for them, that is a sort of normal occurrence. But I think for a lot of adults, it's just like, I woke up today and I have this professorship, and so whatever I say is right. We don't want to learn anymore. And I think, so my students are dealing with, particularly during the sort of political landscape of the recent election, they're interested in sort of voter disenfranchisement, just like a lot of people are. They're really interested in whiteness. White students are interested in whiteness and how they can sort of confront it. They are very, very keen on shutting up when they feel like they're taking up too much space. I mean, it's just really, really kind of comforting things that are happening in classrooms right now. And I think that they're hungry for education in ways that I wish more people who were adults would mimic.
Hungry for education. Let's just all make that the quote of the day. So we have just a few more minutes left, and I want to make sure, so for those of you who don't know Kevin's literary criticism, Kevin's a guy that I always text. I'm like, what should I be reading? Because I don't actually read it, because after he tells me, I'm like, I can't.
It's so true. I'm always like, did you read that book? And it's like,
yeah. I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm like, let me text Kevin. So I asked Kevin to give us some books. So I'm gonna put these books on, and Kevin, maybe if you can, these are recommendations. Maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about them, why you recommend them.
Sure.
Because we want to spread the love.
Absolutely. So the first thing is, I think everybody should read a Baldwin biography. There are a few, but I think David Leeming's is the best. It's simply called James Baldwin. It's been reissued in the wake of I Am Not Your Negro, and so you can now get it. When I was in college, I used it a lot for my thesis. But what I love about this particular biography is that it's written chronologically with Baldwin's works. So you're working through what he's writing while Leeming is taking us through his life. Okay, Heavy by Kiese Lehman speaks for itself. It is a brilliant, brilliant memoir. It's Lehman's memoir about, in some sense, being overweight, but not just sort of physically overweight, like emotionally and psychologically. I think it's one of the best pieces of nonfiction to have occurred in the 21st century. I really think of him in this book in particular being in conversation with Baldwin. It's inimitable. Everybody needs to read it, and particularly because he calls it Heavy, an American memoir. So it's just to tell it what it's about. He writes it to his mother. I mean, just like a brilliant device. So trying to work out issues that she's saddled him with. Okay, The Death of Vivek Oji. I think it's one of the best things to deal with what we refer to often as trans identity that I've seen. Although the character in the novel wouldn't necessarily refer, and I'm going to say himself because for the duration of the novel, that's the the kind of identity that he feels, although he exists between these two spaces. It's heartbreaking. It's brilliantly written. And I've given it to so many people and said, you will understand how to just let people live in their own identity once you read this novel. So it's a brilliant novel. And then Lie With Me is a French novel, although the English translation is really, really good. If you can read it in French, do that. But if you can't, that's a novel about a man. Well, I put that on there mostly because it deals with queer desire in this beautiful and heartbreaking way, in terms of investigating the experiences that make one queer, that you then return to later in your life, and you wonder, what actually did affect me in the way that I thought it did when I was younger? So those are 4 books that I think will be good, certainly for Pride Month.
Well, my question is, did you read Lie With Me in French?
I did. I read it both in French and English because Besson is a writer that I like, but I did read the English one because I was interested in the translation. Molly Ringwald translated it into English.
Oh, okay.
And it's really good. It's really good.
So we had a question about where we find you. So we find Kevin at Kevin Quinn Reads on Instagram, and you can find all of his criticism or a lot of his books. And as I said, he has a new venture coming out, new magazine, Citizen Magazine, this summer, where he will be offering his talents as well. So we only have 2 minutes left. I just want to thank all Kevin and Regina. I love working with both of you, and I knew this was going to be a really rich conversation. And I think it's a great conversation that we have for Pride, that we, being Yale, we just kind of took it back to the book, right? We'll have our Pride party next time, but we had to get a little lecture in. I also if you want to follow more of the Yale Black Alumni Association, you can follow us at or go to yaleblackalumni.org, as well as Yale Gala, LGBTQ+ alumni at yalegala.org. So if there are no other comments from Kevin or Regina, I just want to thank everyone, and of course the Alumni Association, for our broadcast today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I hope I spoke coherently.
It was lovely. Okay. And this broadcast will be on the Yale Alumni Association's our YouTube page. And if you didn't get some of the links, you can just watch it again. Thanks, everyone, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Bye-bye.